trust is the willingness to do something with someone else when you can't assure the outcome, right? If I know what the outcome is, I don't have to trust you to actually go forward, right? The worst period of trust ever we measured in the US was in 2020. They don't believe any of your messaging, so they don't even hear about your new products, so they don't actually buy any of them, right? They return the stuff they bought from you because although you said it can actually work, they don't trust it will actually work. So you have these two trajectories of a relationship that ultimately the spread between those are the value at risk.
First of all, welcome everyone who's joining today's session. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the CEO of Fedora Board, and I'm joined today by Alex Genove, who is the co-host, head of customer research at Zappos. I'm going to ask Alex and Bruce to introduce themselves in a second, but it's a real pleasure to introduce the first guest of the Trust Builders, Bruce Temkin. I had the pleasure of meeting him at X4 in London right before COVID. It was a real pleasure, and someone that I've always looked forward to grace the X4 stage in Salt Lake City and all over the world. So it's a distinct pleasure. Of course, Bruce doesn't need an introduction, but for those who may not be aware, started his very extensive career from Forrester as an analyst, setting up the CXPA and going on to set up his own consultancy that was then acquired by Qualtrics. And then we had the wonderful thought leadership from the XM Institute. And certainly someone who's really kind of had really thoughtful reflections on the whole area of CX, and calling, always used to see on the eve of the new year what the theme for the year was. Always it was between that and obviously seeing other key trends as well. But maybe if I could ask Alex to introduce himself, and then we'll ask Bruce to kick off, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Chris, for the warm introduction. I'm super excited. Bruce, I think the first time we've met here face to face, but I'm a big fan and looking forward to the conversation. As Chris mentioned, I lead customer research and marketing insights at Zappos. I've been with Zappos for almost 10 years now. And my background is in experimental social psychology. And I started applying this background to the business world 25 years ago in different industries. And in my side role at Zappos as a keynote speaker, I met Chris years ago, and we struck a great friendship and a great collaboration. So looking forward to this conversation and beyond.
Superb. And Bruce, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm excited to be here because I think, nothing's better than building trust, and no better way to do it than on a trust building discussion, right? So I think you did as good a job introducing me as I could do, but I'll tell you a little anecdote story because Alex might get a kick out of this. I met Tony Hsieh, who's the founder, people may not know, the founder of Zappos, in Zappos' early days. And I was at Forrester Research, and I was researching the way that he was building culture at Zappos in the early days. And I remember I was about to talk to him, and he tweets out that, he's not sure he's going to have the energy for the discussion, like not at me, but I saw his tweet right before. So he doubled up on some Red Bull. So, I'm going into this research interviewing knowing that Tony Hsieh had doubled up on Red Bull to talk to me. And it was a memorable discussion. So, Zappos has done some amazing things over the years. And so I'd share that little. It has nothing to do with trust, but I trust that Alex is going to be awesome in everything he says, and I appreciate being part of this.
Maybe that's a great place to start. Tony Hsieh, trailblazed the whole concept of, the culture of wow and this idea of customer centricity. And Bruce, you know, each year you would stand up and talk through the key stats around trust deficit, and that organizations, there's a recent Harvard Business Review article that indicated that only 70% of the US workforce trusted the organizations that they work for, which I find to be quite a challenge. But maybe you could just your background in the research to potentially give a perspective, and then we'll get into some of the detail on that.
Yeah, so one of the things I've been, from my days at Forrester, then at Temkin Group, and then at XM Institute, I've been doing analysis of it was mostly the US marketplace. When we got to the XM Institute, I started tracking things globally, but I'll talk a little bit about this sort of time series look at trust that we've had since 2012. So I've been measuring trust that long in the US. And what's interesting is just at a macro level, the trust today is about what it was in 2012. So, you know, everything, people talk about stats in different ways. So you might say, okay, things haven't changed, but in fact, there's a lot of change that's happened over those years, right? We hit a high of trust in 2017, which is an interesting time in the US, right, post-election, for whatever reason. And then we've been on a sharp decline since then. So we were at like 59%, and we've like dropped to back down to 50% after a just the worst period of trust ever we measured in the US was in 2020. So I think that one of the things that we see is, and we see this in a lot of consumer data, right, that the attitudes that human beings have for the institutions that they do business with are oftentimes affected by macro trends, right? So it's almost not, if you're an organization, it's almost not important for you where the overall level of trust is, because wherever it is, it's up to you to build the level of trust with your stakeholders at that moment, given whatever attitudes your people have. Like if anyone said, well, people don't trust us because there's this overall lack of trust, I would say bull, and then I'd probably swear if I wasn't like being recorded, right? I'd say, you know, you have to take accountability for earning the trust that you need to have your stakeholders do the things that you want them to do. And so that's, given all of that, and I think you referred to it, at XM Institute, we've been, and at Temkin Group, we've been labeling the theme for the year, and 2024 is the year of trust. We think it's that important. And I should say I'm no longer with Qualtrics or XM Institute. I love Qualtrics, I love XM Institute, so nothing going on there. Just doing my own thing again.
Might be a good opportunity to bring Alex. So we have this mood music of trust, you know, being at the 50% level, not tracking over time and seeing it going up and down. And then Bruce switched to the individual accountability at an organizational level to say, well, it's actually up to you. So how do you balance that between this overall environment where trust is low and the individual leader trying to engender that sense of trust? Are people naturally skeptical of you know, the organizational fads to improve trust, or where are we at from your perspective in getting that balance, Alex? And maybe that's a question that you link in with Bruce as well.
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah, so this is, I mean, first of all, an incredibly important topic, and for me, on my part, you know, I've been when I go and talk about the work at Zappos and just the importance of humanizing business, this topic of trust comes up, and just like you, Bruce, you know, the work we've been doing at Zappos, part of it is measuring sentiment in the general population of US consumers, more specifically in retail. And maybe we can later on we can address the question of how we think of how we conceptualize trust and what it is and how we measure it, right? Because that's it matters. On our part, I've been using this statement or question that I personally remember hearing Frederick Kell talk about years ago. And that's how we conceptualize trust. And it's retailers always have my best interest as a customer in mind. So that's, I remember hearing that and started using it. And I do a net promoter calculation on it, just like it does the net promoter score. So the score can vary between 100 and minus 100. And can you guess where on that calculation where it's at, where it has been for the past 4 or 5 years? Any guesses?
I'm guessing around 0.
Minus 60. So it is. So it's.
You were close, Bruce. You were getting there.
Josh in the notes, minus 70%, I think, wins the conceptual award. That was pretty close.
Right. So and so we haven't been measuring it for as long as you have, right? But even those years between starting 18, 19, right? It dipped during the pandemic, but then it went up to minus 58 more recently. So the point is, it's really a different methodology, but it corroborates what you're saying, Bruce, right? And Mike, I have we can talk about how we conceptualize it, but your point about the macro environment, to what extent do you attribute that to just the way business is done in a way, right? It's everybody's beholden to, or most companies are beholden to a reporting structure. Every quarter they have to make certain numbers, right? And that obviously leads to decisions downstream.
No, I think that plays into the micro view, right? Company by company. I don't think that plays into the macro view. I think the macro view is really based on what's going on in politics, what's going on in the economy, and what's going on in the world. And I think because having tracked consumer sentiment across dozens and dozens of things for decades, right? I have not found the operations of what's happening inside of companies as the big driver of overall sentiment. So it's sort of like, as a company, you have to operate inside of this outside world where attitudes and sentiment of the people you care about are going up and down through measures that you don't control. All you have to do, you saw it in like large scale with the pandemic, right? Think about the attitudes of people. Initially, they were, oh my God, everyone's scared. And then everyone, oh my God, everyone was willing to help everyone else. And like, there was this enormous sort of group hugs and, swaying together, were willing to put up with it. And then post-COVID, people didn't want to hear anything anymore. And so like, I think that the macro picture, that's why I sort of say the macro picture, I say to organizations, don't think about affecting that. But I'll also say something, I like to think about like jujitsu moves, right? A jujitsu move is when you use someone else's energy, right? Some other energy, and use it for yourself, right? So if trust is low, I say that's a good thing at the micro level, right? Because if people are generally not trusting, then I have the ability to really create the perception of trust and then really stand out, right? If your number, Alex, was like plus 90, right? I have to work hard just to be average level of trust that the person has. Minus 60, I know I can beat that, right? So I know I can stand out and trust if I put my mind to it.
That's a wonderful link back, because I think the ability to exceed expectations and also I'm tempted to bring in to build on your analogy there, because I know Alex there was a twinkle in his eye when you mentioned the martial arts. So maybe that idea of movement and how you can create and surprise and exceed, shifting emotion towards trust. Alex, is there a link there in terms of how you bring that together?
Absolutely, Bruce. And Chris knows me really well, so knows my personal passion for Kung Fu, for example. And the two tenets of Kung Fu, which I really love and I try to apply in life, is two things: improve yourself and help others. That's it. It's not exceed. It's not conquer others, or it's not be the best. It's two things: improve yourself and help others. And I think linking it back to, I mean, we can probably bring back the Zappos story, because this is a great example. And why is Zappos so famous all over the world? Zappos is turning now 25, and we are selling only locally in the US. And but everywhere around the world I go, people know about Zappos. They've read about the case studies and so on. And why is that? It's because back in the day, Tony, and just Bruce, one little correction here. There was a founder of Zappos, is Bruce Schwimmer, Nick Schwimmer. So he's the founder. He went to Tony to invest, and so Tony was the first investor and the first CEO. And then what they had, this epiphany about customer service and winning through empathy and customer service, when everybody else was cutting customer service and was considering it a necessary evil. Very interestingly, back then there was no data to support it. It was this kind of vision and this belief, right, and which proved out to be true. But what it is based on is this idea of not only service, but taking it up a level, which is hospitality. The idea of really, and I used maybe Bruce, you've read Danny Meyer's work on hospitality and setting the table, and he distinguishes service from hospitality. And hospitality is really levels above that, which is doing something for your customers that goes above and beyond. So being on your customer's side and so on. So that's, to me, is a great example of when you invest in something and you eat up the cost in that case to provide an amazing customer experience, and we see the results.
Yeah, and I'd love to pile on the Zappos thing, because I think that some people oftentimes misunderstand the hospitality piece of it, right? And they try and layer on superficial things. What Zappos did is realize that people, in order to really feel comfortable and trust buying shoes online, they needed to be able to return them. Right? So Zappos invested really heavily in making it, they were the first retailer I know to make it easy to return. And so that built trust in a couple ways. First of all, it gave the consumer the view that Zappos knew them because they understood that and they cared about them. But it also did a second part of trust, because if we talk about trust, there's cognitive and affective trust, which are types of trust, but then there's contextual items that impact it. So what that did is it lowered the risk of doing business with Zappos. And a part of the trust, and if we think about what trust is the willingness to do something with someone else when you can't assure the outcome, right? If I know what the outcome is, I don't have to trust you to actually go forward, right? So part of trust, what they did is they built trust in the organization, but they lowered the level that trust was required given the context of the purchase. It was just magnificent move.
That's a fantastic analogy and fantastic definition of trust, Bruce. I think that's exactly what we need to, when we talk about trust, we need those concrete definitions so that we know what we're talking about and what we're ultimately measuring. I mean, all of us can think back to just bring this to life. If all of us on this call think about the first time we purchased something online, I mean, back in the, I remember that moment. That was years and years ago on Amazon, and I put in my credit card number, and I didn't know what was going to happen, right? It goes out in the ether, and you hope for a package to arrive, right? And then I think that speaks to your point about what really trust is.
Yeah, I want the
So
whole.
I would, you talk about definitions, I would push the audience and everyone to just buy in. Meyer, Davis, and Shorman have a great definition. That's the one that I use. I think it's a fundamental, the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation that the other will perform a particular action important to the truster, irrespective of the ability to monitor or control that other party. It's a little consultancy, a little academic, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what I said, which is the willingness to do something with another party when you can't control the outcome.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, we all have heard of these team building exercise, right? Where somebody falls back and you have to, you catch them, and that's you expect. You can't see backwards, right? You kind of that's physical manifestation of that. Absolutely.
I'd like to build on the idea that in terms of bringing this into the practicalities, Bruce used the word risk. And I think the practitioners here would be saying, well, how do I reduce risk, i.e., how do I reduce the factors that will erode trust? So, I think we've got a great definition of trust provided by Bruce. How do we then link that? So I think we've got the fact that, there's this ability to measure trust, the ability to define trust. Thinking about the drivers of trust, and I saw, Bruce, you posted about the idea of prescriptive insights, the ability to prescribe an insight to then reduce a risk. I'd love to kind of dial into that. How do the practitioners effectively reduce risk by resolving the drivers that potentially erode trust? Or is it a broader practice around an organization around sharing information, recognizing excellence, those sort of attributes that build a culture of trust?
So I'll take a shot first. I think that when I think about trust, I always think about there's the trustor and the trustee. Those are languages I use all the time, right? The trustor is a person who has to trust someone else. Trustee is the one who has to earn the trust of what the person is, right? So the trustee has ways in which they can build cognitive trust, meaning if you're an organization, like Alex talked about Zappos, there are things that you can do that make you earn the trust. You can act consistently. You don't overhype. You're transparent about important communication fees. You take responsibility when you make a mistake. All of those things are representations to the trustor that you are trustworthy. And they take that belief of your trustworthiness into other areas, and they're willing to take more risks with you. They're willing to do bigger things. Like if you're a bank and you want someone to take out a big loan or move into an investment world with you, well, if you haven't built trust in the other things that you've done, they're not going to take that bigger risk with you. So I think there's a bunch of stuff you can do if you have a relationship. There's also a bunch of things you can do if you don't, where you're forming a new relationship with a trustor, make a strong first impression, communicate clearly, share your credentials, right? And then the third area I would talk quickly about, let Alex give his thoughts, is we talked a little bit about, there's trust between a trustor and trustee, but then there's the context. Every situation has contextual items, what's happening in that moment. And you can lower perceived risk, like Zappos did with, sort of making returns. That lowers need for trust. You can reduce uncertainty. One of the big problems with trust that people have is uncertainty, right? If I was to go back to Alex's point, right? Alex made his first purchase with his credit card online, right? And if they didn't tell him your order was confirmed and here's when you're going to get it, and reduce the uncertainty of what was happening next, then his trust would be really, really low. But if they started to say, here's what's going to happen, here's exactly when you hear about it, here's the feedback, like that would lower the perceived trust by reducing uncertainty.
So could I just then I suppose, and Alex, from a retailer perspective, and you know this in terms of the journey that customers go to put an item in a basket, right? If you're trying to reduce that uncertainty, is this where the likes of challenger banks and neobanks who are starting that digital journey from scratch are able to accelerate that ability to build trust because they're essentially almost trying to reduce the uncertainty, as you called it, from the get-go in the experience, whereas traditional experiences have to work harder? Could I understand from a practitioner point of view, the challenge of building trust in a journey that is pre-existing versus some of those, like I'm thinking EQ Bank, I'm thinking Monzo, and some of these other, fast-growing organizations that are suddenly, jumping ahead of traditional approaches. So we'd love to hear just your thoughts on.
Sure thing, Chris. I mean, before I address that, I think just doubling down on what Bruce was saying about the relationship between trust and risk, it's very essential to unpack that because it is this, it's almost like the prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. If both parties are trying to reduce risk, then we have this crisis of trust because the actions then that are taken to protect yourself then essentially hurt the other party. That, I think that's the dilemma. Because if for example, Zappos was trying to reduce their risk of losing money, right, then they would take actions that would hurt the other party. I think that's so important to understand that, because the more we double down on operations and trying to hit a number, right, then that results, and that may explain this the deficit of trust, because then the other person is trying to protect themselves. So what they're going to do is they're going to purchase less, right? Because I protect myself by purchasing less from a company that protects itself, and so on. So the concept of trust is this, is trying to reverse that process and saying, I'm gonna invest in reducing your risk, not reducing my risk, in a way. Of course, any company has to protect themselves and have to. So it's this balance of, and I want to bring in this great quote by none other than the Dalai Lama, who this was quoted in the Harvard Business Review, and he talks about that everybody, including companies and individuals, are driven by self-interest. That's a given. But what he advocates for is what he calls wise self-interest, that takes the other party's best interest in mind. And so that's what we're talking about, is this balance. And it's obviously more important for new experiences, Chris, like you mentioned, because then you don't know what to expect. But one other thing I want to bring in to Bruce's point is this, the ideas of fiduciary relationships, and it's probably the highest level of risk or uncertainty, because you don't know what's going on under the hood. So it's relationships between consumers and auto mechanics, right? Most consumers don't know how engines work. With doctors, with lawyers, it's this area where you have the experts and they keep the knowledge secret in a way, right? Because that's how they make their money, and then you have to trust that they're working in your best interest in mind.
And I'm wondering, Bruce, you've done some work around this idea of value at risk, where you can calculate that. So building the business case in an organization to build trust, it's great conceptually to say we want to build trust, but the idea of value at risk and actually bringing that to decision makers to build the business case for improving trust, could we maybe link the two things together? Kind of double down on what you were saying, but also build further on what Alex has said as well.
Yeah, I'd love to pile on Alex's great comments, right? Which is that the idea of that we're all self-interested is not a problem; it's a reality, right? And so I always say, let's deal with reality. And so I think the part of understanding self-interest and using it, once again in the jiu-jitsu, is for having leaders understand that it is in their self-interest to build trust, right? And that's the difference between, I think, transactional analysis versus longitudinal analysis, right? Like, you might do something different if you're looking at a transaction when you're trying to build trust than you would if you're trying to look at lifetime value of a customer or a family of customers, right? And so the notion of value, to me, value at risk has to do with when it comes to trust, which is, what are the future behaviors of the party you care about? What's the trajectory of the future behaviors of the party you care about, with and without trust? So you can think about this one trajectory of a relationship when you've created trust, right? And that's where if it's customer, this works with your family, with your loved ones, with your aunts, with your uncle, right? With your politicians, with your constituents, right? But one trajectory has, and we'll talk about customers, has them willing to listen to your product messages more, willing to try some of your new products, willing to work with you if there's a problem, right? That's one trajectory. The other trajectory is they don't believe any of your messaging, so they don't even hear about your new products, so they don't actually buy any of them, right? They return the stuff they bought from you because although you said you can actually work, they don't trust it will actually work. So you have these two trajectories of a relationship that ultimately the spread between those are the value at risk, right? They're doing in one trajectory, they're willing to do more, they're easier to serve, they're, even telling friends, right? So you actually can look at the different behaviors that happen over time and identify the value of those individual behaviors on those two different curves and say, okay, at any moment in time, any year over time, and oftentimes what happens if it's a type of business that has a multi-year relationship, the value expands, the value differential between those two trajectories gets larger and larger over time.
And it's great, Bruce, that you're bringing the customer lifetime value in this, and I also love how you brought in the human into the conversation, because we can have this whole conversation based on just numbers, right? We can look at the statistics, metrics, and so on. And earlier in your career, you focused on that. You focused on the statistics, the metrics, the analysis. So I have a question for you now. Now you're talking about humanity and humanization and humanity at scale. So tell us a little bit about how you transitioned from this look into just the numbers and the stats to looking more at humans in general.